right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Today I won't be doing this video alone. I've got a face that you're going to see today you won't recognize, not from this channel, unless you watch this channel and you're very local, extremely local. Matter of fact, you're so local you've been around me physically, maybe at work. You're not going to recognize this face from YouTube, from anywhere. Today I'm going to be talking to a lovely lady here who used to work with me at a job. But she's been right here on the ground in our backyard. She's attended, some of the local protests about what's happened with the George Floyd tragedy. Outspoken, very intellectual woman. We don't hold exactly every view the same, but she also considers herself an independent, just as I do. And I want to kind of run some of the topics that I've been talking about on the channel by her and get her takes on things. So without, further ado, here is Miss Jess, and let's hear what she has to say. What got you into politics, to give it a lot of deep thought? What really, piqued your interest in that?
I was raised in a household where we spoke pretty openly about politics. It was something that various family members, the grown-ups in the family would debate all the time in our household. And, so I was always kind of exposed to it even from a young age. And then actually it was when I was a teenager, about 10 years ago, when the Arab Spring protests happened. At the time, I was starting to get active on heavy metal forums because that's kind of a primary interest of mine is heavy metal music in general. And on some of these forums, you would talk to people from all over the world. Where there were actually a few people from countries like Tunisia who started to talk about what they were going through in their communities as the protests were met with violent crackdowns. And that was something that was fascinating to experience within our own community. So
yeah,
okay, cool.
I've stated this a lot in a lot of my videos. My family was kind of split in a lot of ways. So my dad, definitely more on the Republican side of the aisle. But on my mom's side of the family, that's a lot of those blue-collar Democrats. My grandpa on that side of the family came up just after FDR days, and that's really influenced where his positions kind of were on politics. That rolled over. My mom considers herself a Democrat. She was pretty vocal. She was a Bernie Sanders supporter. But who really got me interested into politics personally was Jesse Ventura. I started watching a lot of Jesse Ventura clips some years back. Really got me interested into it. So that's what kind of, opened me up to the fact that the Democrats and the Republicans are kind of, the ones you see getting elected every single cycle, and yet we seem to not really be able to accomplish very much. Where would you say that you are politically? Do you consider yourself more independent? Are you on the left? I would say on the right, but I know you well enough to know you're not on the right. So
No, I am a registered independent. I do lean left on most issues. I think further left in general than the Democratic Party. There are a few issues that I will side. I'll swing a little more to the right. Mainly gun control is one of those.
yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, I see myself aligning more with leftist ideas in general.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on that too. And maybe we could be oddballs from the rest of the country as a whole for the fact that in the South there's really that different view of guns. When you go out and to out west or up north, you get a lot of different takes on stuff like that. But I'm right there with you. The gun control thing separates me from a lot of other people that have talked about a lot of this stuff on YouTube. But as far as agenda, like healthcare, for example, by no means do I think that right-wing plans are the way to go when we're looking at the healthcare system. And even Obamacare, when you look at the fine print of that, was really kind of based off of, you can compare it to Romney Care. Some even go back as far as to Richard Nixon, what Richard Nixon had proposed. The key thing about Romney and Nixon, both of those were Republicans. So you really didn't get a very left-leaning healthcare program. And that's something that always killed me, is that, the Republicans criticized Obamacare. I could certainly make some criticisms there too, but the Republicans are criticizing something that kind of was the brainchild of their own party. How does that strike you when you see that?
Well, there's a lot there. Um, I guess let me start. We don't have the healthcare system that we do have in this country. To say that it's a left-leaning or right-leaning system, I think, is kind of redundant. Really, what we need is an efficient healthcare system. I think that is the
Right.
one thing everybody can agree on. And right now, we don't have that. Or
No.
I think that there is a fear, a deeply instilled fear of anything with the term social or socialized in it
Yes.
among a lot of the American public. And so we don't want to look at the healthcare systems that are working in other countries as an example of how to reform ours, because the healthcare systems that are working in every other developed country are to some extent socialized, even if it's not entirely subsidized by the government.
Right.
That's something that, yeah, not still not a popular idea, popular enough among most voters for politicians to be comfortable voicing their support in favor of looking at those different ways of doing it.
Now, in your experience, what would you say that the biggest reason is for why American people don't understand how the rest of the world works when it comes to healthcare? Why is there such a stigma? Do you think that's because of the mainstream media and the way that they cover issues such as that? Do you think it's because of the politicians, like, the Joe Bidens, or even the right wingers, even Amy Klobuchar's and Mayor Pete's, who take money from big pharma? Or do you think it's a little bit of both, considering that they're sponsors to the political campaigns and they run the commercials on mainstream media?
Well, I think that something that we sometimes miss is that the mainstream media, or news media, and mainstream politicians are both essentially playing to the same general audience. The
Exactly.
people who are more likely to be consuming local to national and international news media are those who are more likely to vote, and especially they're more likely to vote independent. And those are often the swing voters. Those are sometimes the most valuable voters. When you have a winner-take-all election like the presidential election, that's the one that they're looking for the most.
Right.
That's the audience that they need. So they're playing to the same people. And so sometimes I think when we hear the same ideas that are voiced by mainstream politicians be voiced by mainstream media, we've got to remember that they are both playing to the same audience. And so it's the American people who at some point have to take responsibility, stand up and say, we need change, and we need to stop being afraid of what anybody tells us to be afraid of, whether it's the politicians or the media. But it's a kind of two sides of the same coin there.
Yeah. I've tried to talk to a lot of different people, about this issue. But even, folks within my family, for example, they hear that term that the government's going to run it, and they run in fear and cringe and tell you, oh no, socialism, socialism. And by no means do I advocate for full blown socialism. I feel like you've got pros and cons to both. Capitalism kind of gets really buried, but it's what we see in the world around us today is not the ideal capitalism. It is crony capitalism, which is more for the rich and less for everyone else. Uh, you know, Likewise, when socialism is ran completely unchecked and not monitored either, you could get, roads that lead to some of these other countries where you get, either communism or dictators. So you've got to get that fine line. To me, I like the idea of the mixed economy, where you incorporate the a little bit of aspects of both. But the one thing that I would say to people who think that any form of socialism is an absolute boogeyman would be that if you enjoy having police, public schools, firefighters, and things of this nature, guess what you're advocating for? You're advocating for a form of socialism, because that is funded through local government, sometimes state government, if you're looking at like state troopers, tax funds are collected and they fund these goods and services for you. So ideally, that would kind of be the same thing for government health care. So if you enjoy having public schools, police, and all these things, then you're in favor of a form of socialism. Yet somehow that just blows right over people's heads, you know?
Well, I think it comes down to what people already have and are comfortable with.
Right.
And they've accepted that because for a while in this country, for decades, we were accepting, versions of a social welfare program
Right.
within the state. And then that started to be reversed, like you said before, with, Republican presidents, in previous decades, and has led us to where we are now. And unfortunately, we have a system that is not able to, it wasn't even able to handle what it had back months ago compared to where we are now when all the unemployment cases hit with coronavirus and the shutdown.
Exactly.
It flooded the employment offices, and they weren't able to process all of these numbers in time. For weeks, we didn't even get the full numbers, even though they were skyrocketing, because all those applications had not been processed yet. So we still will never really fully know how many people were unemployed as of March 2020.
Right.
April.
And following up with the whole COVID-19 that you kind of referenced there, and the fallout of that, 2020 has definitely been one hell of a year for us. For God's sakes, we start off the year thinking we're on the brink of war with Iran because Trump goes out having a pissing contest, shooting missiles over and killing Soleimani. So we start off with that. But before long, the COVID incident hits. I feel like I could even be missing something in between Soleimani and COVID-19, but definitely COVID-19 hit. That has taken its toll, not just on us, but the rest of the world. And within a month or so after, South Carolina started locking down, now here we are, and you have the George Floyd tragedy that happened, and now at least those 4 cops are being charged and prosecuted, but that doesn't still fix the problem of what's going on with the racial profiling and things like that a lot of people of color unfortunately have to face within this country. And you've got the protests that are taking place right now. Now you, from my understanding, you've gone to some of the protests here locally in South Carolina. For all the people who try to say that this is nothing but, a bunch of violent people out there with a mission, first of all, I don't agree with that. But being as how you've actually gone to some of these, tell me what your experience has been.
The protests that I've been to were this previous Sunday night and Monday night in downtown Spartanburg, South Carolina. And those protests were peaceful, everything that I saw. What I know is that Sunday, I guess after I left, and I would have left around 9, 10 o'clock, so I think it was sometime around 11 p.m. midnight, that there were 3 individuals arrested for apparently throwing items at cars. Other than that, I actually went to that protest Sunday night because I had heard so many rumors about violence in downtown Spartanburg, and I live fairly close to downtown, close enough that I can say that I would notice if there were riots going on. And I had driven through, there was no sign of anything. I had spoken to other people who had been there. They said that there was no violence or anything going on. I went for myself. We were marching, we were chanting. We saw a lot of, there were a lot of curious onlookers, and some of them looked a little more uneasy than others. But I think, again, that's what you were talking about. With there's a lot of messages in the media right now about how there's a lot of violence going on. I guess people, kind of jump to conclusions when they see something, again, that's unfamiliar to them, like a whole crowd of protesters walking down the street. But really, everything that happened was totally peaceful. And then on Monday night, the time that I was there, we were standing on the side of the road at the intersection of Main Street, and I don't remember what the other one is, but it's sitting there on Daniel Morgan Square across from the Chicken Wing Cafe. And we were waving signs, onlookers, we had people driving by and honking, showing a lot of support. It was a really positive, it was actually really a unifying experience. And you don't hear about that in the media because these types of protests that are peaceful and make up the majority of what's going on are not really hot news right now. People aren't sharing those articles. People aren't talking about it. It is being covered. It's not just not capturing the interest of the American public.
No. Um,
I haven't seen any photos or videos of the
yeah.
peaceful protests as opposed to there's a lot going on with the violence that's happening.
And you make a very good point. Unfortunately, our mainstream media doesn't want to really talk about the things where there's unity there. That's not, people burning down an O'Reilly's, burning down the Target. They want to focus on those issues. And to be honest, that's why when the CNN Center got hit in Atlanta, I felt no sympathy for that whatsoever. To me, the mainstream media has failed the country in doing what its primary job is supposed to be, and that's informing the people. And what I mean by that is they might tell you something that's going on, but they want to pitch the story in such a way that it draws out your anger, that it makes you mad. And if you're watching Fox News, it's going to make you mad at all the left Democrats or anyone who considers himself to the left, even if they are independent. Likewise, if you're watching CNN, MSNBC, you watch that channel, you're probably going to be infuriated because, Orange Man has done something bad today, and they're going to talk to you about the police brutality. What I don't hear enough of, if I hear it at all, is why a lot of this stuff happens to these communities. So to me, what I look at when I see what's going on is I look at the police brutality and then I think to myself, I say, okay, who has turned us into such a police state in this country? Who has passed things like the Patriot Act? Who passed the crime bill back in the 90s? And it's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats. They've worked together to institute a lot of the things that have, one, attacked everyone's freedoms in a way, but specifically with the war on drugs, with stop and frisk, with the crime bill, this has impacted people of color. And yet, when CNN or anyone wants to cover what's happening to these people of color, they want to tell you what the problem is, but they don't do enough journalism to tell you why that problem is there. The reason why, in my opinion, is because if they actually inform, people would probably stop voting for the Democrats and the Republicans, and they'd finally realize they're the problem. What say you to that?
Something interesting that I noticed a few nights ago, I was watching a live stream being filmed by a protester of the protests going on in Asheville. And I was watching peaceful demonstrations. I was actually watching rioters, not, I'm sorry, protesters chanting, "I don't see no riot here. Why are you in riot gear?" And at the same time, there was a local news station. I don't even remember which one. It was a local news affiliate of one of those major news stations. And they had a live stream that was going, but they were set up behind police lines where, theoretically they would be safe from anything that could happen. So meanwhile, you have this peaceful demonstration that is going on in Asheville. And they started being herded in specific directions by cops. And you see them, they're still just marching peacefully. They have signs. Again, there isn't any violence. There isn't any stone throwing. There isn't any, fires breaking out. And what started to happen was the police started to press up on the tents where they had medical supplies set up and where they had cases of water set up. And the police started to press in on them. They started forcing people back, and then they started destroying those tents. They just started destroying those supplies. Some of those supplies are meant to help treat patients who are coughing and sneezing uncontrollably as a result of tear gas, which has been used in Asheville, has been used in other areas in North Carolina, like Charlotte, for instance, and also in Columbia, South Carolina. To my knowledge, I don't believe tear gas has been used at any time in Spartanburg or Greenville, although don't quote me on that if something's happened that I didn't know about. Right. I have not been to any of the protests in Greenville, let me be clear. At the same time, this starts happening, protesters are suddenly running They are scared. They are screaming at each other to grab what they can and run because the police are destroying everything. And at the same time, this news crew that's behind the police line is saying, we think we see something happening up ahead. We're not really sure what's going on. We're going to try to get a closer look. But because they were in this location that was designated for them by the police, while the police in other locations of the city are herding the protesters in specific directions, it's almost pretty much ensuring that the local media is not going to have that specific coverage of what's going on with the protesters. And in fact, I don't believe that that story would have made the national headlines that it has made since then, except that it was caught on local protesters' video camera that was a live stream. There were at least 3,000 people watching at the same time that I was. I was actually texting my mother with the live updates of what was going on. Like, you're not going to believe what's going on in Asheville right now and how people are describing. If you did this in a battle zone, it would have been considered a war crime. So why are local police allowed to do this to peaceful protesters who really, you could tell, were not doing anything? And there are allegations, the same thing happening in Charlotte, the same thing happening in Raleigh, the same thing happening in Columbia. But you'll see that in cities that have accepted, where the police have accepted the protests, and not just for 5 seconds kneeling for a media shoot before they get up and start gassing protesters, but when they actually walk with them, talk to them, find out what the community needs, what they want to say, engage with your community. Enforcement does not always have to be about force. That should be a last resort, because in communities where the police have stayed peaceful, you've seen for the most part the protests have stayed peaceful too. And that is something I think America should be paying attention to.
Definitely. The issue with what's going on with the police right now, certainly the government could take measures to try to do this, but to me, something that I've thought about a lot recently is when you look at a lot of who becomes police officers. Now, and let me be clear, because me and you haven't really talked about this too much. The people who watch my channel kind of know where I stand on that. One, I have a major respect for all veterans and police officers as a whole. There's a couple of Spartanburg County deputies who were members of my lodge, for example. However, I'm not going to, not call it like I see it. And what I see a lot of times are people, some of the cases who try to become police officers, either wanted to join the military, didn't quite think they could make it in the military, but they had something that made them want to be in the military, or they come out of the military and then become police officers. Now, some don't have an issue. Some that wanted to join the military and became a cop, it doesn't bother them. Others who leave the military and become a cop, doesn't bother them. The folks who concern me are those who are just battle hungry. Okay? And what I mean by that is, and I'm not going to name any names here, but you'll know who I'm talking about. Gentlemen that worked with us back when you were at the same site as me. Former military, very gung-ho. He's wanting to rejoin the military right now, and he has told me point blank, when he joined, he wanted to be put into a war zone. He wanted to go for combat. When he didn't get combat, basically it rained all over his parade, because that's the whole reason he joined. Now, that kind of mindset, I can't understand that. And I doubt you can either, because, to me, combat in a war zone should be absolute, just to defend your country. And if I joined the military and was fortunate enough to not have to do that, I wouldn't be upset. I would be counting my blessings, because it means that I was safe and able to go back home at the end of the day. But some folks just clearly have it in their mind that's what they want to do. They're very gung-ho, even in security. I've encountered people who were just so gung-ho that they wanted, like in the loss prevention side, they were just ready to tackle that shoplifter and turn it into a brawl. That kind of mentality, I think, is what a big part of the problem is with the police forces out there. They watch too much television. They watch too many cop shows, military movies, and they're just they want to live out an action movie. That's the way it strikes me, and I think that the police force should really pay attention, maybe even some mental evaluation of people like that, because I don't think that's someone joining simply to protect and serve. That's someone looking for the opportunity to get into a fight. What do you think about that?
I think that working in security has shown me that there are a number of different types of people who go into it for different reasons, and I imagine it's pretty similar to the crowd that you get in law enforcement. And I don't want to make assumptions because I don't know a whole lot of people. I know a few, but I don't know a whole lot of people in law enforcement specifically. I know more people who are actually former law enforcement and transferred over to the private security side once they got out of that.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of people who get into it for good-hearted reasons. I think there are a lot of good-hearted people, within most forces. But I think sometimes when you let one bad apple slide and say it's just one bad apple, that turns into 2, 3, 5, and sometimes you
Yep.
end up with a whole rotten bushel. Look at what's going on in Minneapolis. There is no reason that they should have looked at that video and still allowed any of those people to, one, keep their jobs at all, but two, to get away without charges,
Absolutely.
given that you just killed an innocent man who was unarmed. And I don't care what he did have in the system. I don't care if he had forged that check when he was, suspected of, and that was why they arrested him in the first place. They should have been able to take him into custody easily and without that level of restraint or that amount of time being required. And I think we all saw that in the video. There's no reason to even try to debate that. But the fact that it took a week or more of protests in order for charges to be filed, we still have not seen first-degree murder charges in the case of Derek Chauvin. We've still seen only second-degree murder, and the family themselves are still calling for first-degree murder charges for him. And I think until that happens,
You go ahead.
the protest to subside anytime soon. Until that happens, until the charge is upgraded to first-degree murder for the cop who sat on his neck for 8 minutes, 45 seconds, I do not believe that the protests are likely to subside anytime soon.
No, I believe you're right. And here's the thing: being in this business as long as I've been in it, and I haven't been in it for like 10 years or anything. I'm coming up this year on my 6th year, I believe. So I got in pretty quick after I got out of high school. But here's the thing: just in the forms that I've done, and I've been in those, where like I was mentioning, loss prevention, where you have to detain and things like that. Techniques: if you got to use certain techniques just long enough to detain someone, that's one thing, you know. But that, combined with that and the fact that for a few years I'd taken martial arts, did the wrestling team, things like that. Some things you use just long enough to get what you need to get done. Other things, you don't leave them applied for very long because you can really do damage to someone or kill them. And so the fact that he had to keep his knee on the guy's neck, there's absolutely no excuse for that whatsoever. Some could argue that's a way of holding someone down long enough to get the cuffs on them. That doesn't require 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's absolutely unheard of. Now, one defense they're probably going to make, and to me this is absolutely preposterous, but apparently Minnesota does not have a police academy from what I understand. They have kind of a system where you go and you take like a class to become a cop, almost like a college course. I guess maybe you get a degree in criminal justice, maybe. But there's not a real police academy. To me, in this day and age, that's absolutely insane. Every state should have a police academy, because one, they need to really test you to make sure that you're a cop, not just put you through the book course in college. First of all, second of all, you should really probably properly be properly trained in a lot of these techniques and understand the gravity of them if you don't have any sort of previous training. And I don't know what kind of training in that nature they receive, but considering they don't have a police academy, that certainly raises the eyebrow. So, what were these people taught before we put all this power in their hands and gave them these sort of weapons? That raises a serious eyebrow. Were you aware that they didn't have a police academy there?
I don't know anything about what the training requirements are for the Minnesota police force. I don't want to, I don't know enough about that topic to really comment on it. I know that it's basic training in any type of enforcement training at all. Even what we get as unarmed guards in South Carolina, they make sure to tell you about the use of force and the force continuum. You only apply as much force as is needed in order to handle a situation. Once you can manage it, you can de-escalate it until that force is no longer needed. In fact, it's been said to me before, as far as security goes, de-escalation is professionalism in the security industry. It's something I highly agree with from the time that I've spent doing everything from nightclub security to festival security, and then, working at the warehouse and working in other situations as well.
Right.
No matter what it takes, you have to be able to communicate with whoever the other person or the other people are. You have to be able to communicate with them to try to prevent things from happening in the first place. And when things do arise, you have to be trying to de-escalate that situation as much as possible. The way it always was when I worked at the club was, we do not want to get things to a point where we have to call the cops. We would rather you just leave calmly.
Right.
It's that kind of, can we handle this situation without, but any police, especially in Minnesota, especially where they have already had complaints about use of force, already had complaints about racial discrimination, they should have been going over this regularly with their officers, only applying as much force as is needed. And that is something that needs to be taken more seriously, I think, by all police agencies right now. And I think that's the message, that's one of the messages that's trying to be sent out right now. Your use of force is too strong. And in a lot of cases, unfortunately, at these protests, they are responding with use of force that is far too strong for the situation.
Right. And something that I've also brought up too, is if you move in from out of town, for example, and you want to join the police force, might be a good idea for a lot of these police departments to institute a type of training that includes these sort of officers needing to be familiar with the community. You know what I mean? For example, maybe during their training they have to get out, and go to different events that the town's sponsoring, or get out and go through communities and actually meet and talk to people. To me, when you're looking at the police, to police effectively, you need to understand where you're at. You need to understand the people of your town. And I feel like that's a big divide. You get a lot of, people, and to me, even moving town to town could make a difference. But for example, if you take someone that was a cop here in South Carolina and stick him up in New York, you're talking a whole nother section of the country. You really should get familiar with that area of the country, because policing, it's not going to be the same. Likewise, if you were, a police officer in New York, things are going to be a lot different down here in South Carolina. So that's something that I've always thought they should really, try to address, is get them more familiar with the communities, because number one, it's kind of just human nature. When you stick someone in an element they're not familiar with, it makes them a little more tense, makes them a little more cautious. They don't understand what some people may be doing from that area. So you get them more warmed up to that atmosphere. You get them to kind of understand the people that they're interacting with. That kind of takes some of that stress and tension off of a cop, where they may not be so apprehensive interacting with someone. How do you feel about that?
I think that brings up a really good point, is there are just differences in your environment. There are differences in the types of situations that you're going to see on a regular basis. And that even applies to, like you said, general geographic areas. You take a cop from South Carolina and put them in New York, uh, there's going to be some culture shock involved with that as well. They're going to they're going to come in contact probably with a lot more people from a lot more backgrounds than they're accustomed to. A lot of people from out of state, a lot of people from out of the country, whereas a lot of South Carolina, you don't see as much of that, and so there can be some shock there. There's also just a difference in attitude. There's a difference in the way people go about their day.
Yeah.
From one place to another. If you go to North New York and you are not accustomed to, hurry it up, everybody's going and you need to go with you, you're going to be left behind.
Yeah.
That's how, especially in the North, that's how it just operates. In the South, it's not like that. In the South, you're allowed to take your time a little bit. You're allowed to chat and catch up. It's almost rude if you don't in most cases. So if you're a cop and that's what you're accustomed to in the South, and then you go up to the North and you feel like people are being ruder with you, you feel like people are, giving you attitude because you are not accustomed to the social environment that you're in, that could lead a cop to, misinterpret a situation, escalate something, where it didn't need to be escalated. I could see something like that happening theoretically.
Yeah. You brought that up. If you're from down south, you plan on taking a trip to New York, you better learn and how to kick it into another gear when you're going around the town, because they will walk all over you if you don't. But moving on here, talking about like with some of the protests. So I do collaborations with some other folks. Every Friday night I go on the channel, Big Talk Little Talk, and the host, he brings different people on, and we all talk about some of these things. And not this past Friday, but Friday before last, we had a pretty full house. There were 5 people on the video total. Okay. And there were kind of some back and forth. This is when the violent riots were first starting to happen. I think this was the same night that the CNN Center was hit down in Atlanta. And there were a few people, like when we started to see these stores getting burned down and whatnot, who kind of took that tone of, you shouldn't be concerned really about that. Insurance is going to pay for all of that. The main concern here, the only thing you should focus on is protecting the life. And I won't dispute that. Protecting the life is obviously the first thing there. Here's what my issue has been with a lot of the more riot-based things that we've seen. To me, it's all about knowing your enemy. Okay? And if these folks are genuinely this pissed off at what they're seeing happen, and then they have every right to be. They've been going through this for years, for God's sakes. I mean, if it were happening to me, I can't say I might feel much different. Okay? But if you're to the point that you're ready to hit the streets to almost lead revolution, okay, if that's what the end game here is, to me, I think you might want to study how revolutions have been done. Look at revolutions of the past, and what you don't find is that they attack their own neighborhoods or each other in order to send a message to their problem. They took it to the problem. Proof that I think that if they had not targeted stores within those communities, like burning down O'Reilly's, burning down Targets, burning down other mom and pop shops, but they did also burn down a police station. And I think a lot of the country kind of views that the same way, in the sense there's been polls that were released recently. Kyle Kulinski from Secular Talk talked about them. And he couldn't make sense of this. He couldn't understand why over 50% of Americans that were polled supported that a police station was burned down, but also over 50% of Americans would support military being called in to now squash these protests. He couldn't understand how over 50% could support both things. And to me, this is where it comes across to me. If these sorts of riots had happened at the police station, if government buildings had been hit, and I'm not calling for that, but the reason I say that is because, again, who has been responsible for passing a lot of the laws that give the police that sort of freedom and that sort of teeth to target the people of color? Again, the crime bill that incentivized, more of a profiling on people of color in the war on drugs. Okay? That's your government. They've been holding blue collar down the totem pole for years, but it's really put an impact on the people of color. So you could start with the government. You could start maybe with people like Wall Street, who also bribe the government off to do these sorts of things because they maybe have an invest in these private prisons, or they have the invest in big pharma, the military industrial complex. So there's certainly a problem there in of itself. If the targets had been different, I think you could see, more people supporting what's going on because they're looking from the outside looking in and they see where the problem's really at. However, because these sorts of targets are what were hit, and they really didn't have anything to do with the tragedy with George Floyd, a lot of people are sitting back and looking at that and saying, why did you do that? They weren't involved in this, and yeah, I understand you're pissed. You have every right to be, but they weren't the problem that's contributed to these issues that you face. So why did you attack them? What's your view on that sort of thing?
I think that there are obviously many different contributing factors to what's going on right now, and there's going to be a lot of disagreement on where to draw the line. But to some extent, well, I do want to add that from what I've been seeing in Minneapolis and what I've been seeing from people that I know up in Minneapolis who have been at the protests, as well as statements that were released by the Minnesota state governor and if I recall correctly, the Minneapolis police chief, but I could be wrong about that. But there were a lot of white supremacists who actually infiltrated these protests, and they started a lot of the violence because they made up a lot, like I think 80% of the arrests that happened in Minneapolis, and then there are also the demonstrations in St. Cloud. There was a video that you've probably seen it did go viral, of some protesters who were confronting a guy who was breaking the storefront windows of AutoZone. And I don't know if that one was specifically Minneapolis or St. Cloud, but they started confronting this guy. They said, "Are you a cop?" He didn't answer that. He did threaten to punch one of the protesters. He was dressed entirely in black. He had a black mask on, was carrying a black umbrella, and it was like specifically to obscure his identity. The whole thing was really weird. But after seeing that video, I started hearing those reports pop up in other cities too with demonstrations. In Raleigh, there were photographs of Proud Boys in Raleigh in downtown right before the demonstrations turned violent there. And so the same thing has been reported in Charlotte, that there was possibly a demonstrator who set off fireworks who was a white guy and was later determined to be a white supremacist. I don't know that for sure. That's unconfirmed, but overall, I think that there are agents who are trying to take what's going on right now and turn it into something else in order to delegitimize it. And at the same time, you have people who are more so affiliated with the movement, but are still, in some cases, breaking windows and starting fires as well. There have been videos of like cop cars getting tipped over and such.
Right.
And yeah, and I don't have an easy answer for that. I really don't. All I can really say is they tried kneeling, and we saw where that went. The NFL is now apologizing for how that went, actually.
Yeah. Something, it's like you point out, you've got agitators that are probably, riling this whole thing on and coming from different sides. You mentioned like the Proud Boys there, for example. Um, you know, that's very sad that we still have people who think, and like a lot of the white supremacists out there, that in today's world you have folks like that. But unfortunately, that's a sad truth we have to live with. Doesn't justify it, but it just makes you very sad. One thing that I've mentioned though, and here's the thing. Again, my thing is looking at where a lot of the problems that we see have really came from is again can be targeted back to the government, being as how the government's been bought off, as I brought up, to me, I feel the best way to really go about this is, because the Democrats and the Republicans have pretty much shown us they're not going to do anything. At least they have to me. To me, the best way is kind of just voting them out of office. Now, if we're not going to take that path, and we were to take revolution style, again, you would have to really make sure you do it the right way. And that's always been what I've been saying about this. For the folks who've tried to say that there should be no concern whatsoever in the fact that these stores have burned down, that no one's going to really take a loss in that because insurance is going to pay for it all. I don't agree with that. And here's why. Insurance is based off of a risk. Okay? And if insurance did pay to rebuild those stores, guess what happens to not only that store, but everyone within that vicinity? Insurance premiums are going up because you're more of a risk. So that's going to fall on the backs of these people who do need to run these businesses. Likewise, if they were some sort of a small mom and pop business, and for some reason they can't get insurance money to rebuild, what's your alternative? Go get a loan from the bank? Here's my problem with that. Banks are going to want to make money. And what's to say there's not some rich investor out there that now that all this real estate has burned down, he wants to come in, take the town over because he's got the money, and then he'll build his own new stores. So therefore, people within that community who were middle-class Americans running a small mom and pop shop, they're going to get shafted all the way around by the guy who had the money, and he's going to come in and renovate the whole place potentially. We saw a lot of things like that happen with the housing situation after Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. When you go back to, I believe it was 08 or 09, a lot of houses, when the housing market turned upside down, were bought up by Wall Street investors and banks for pennies on the dollar. Okay? So that's kind of been my contention too, that there's really no need to worry about any of these stores that were burned down. They'll be fine. They'll just be rebuilt and insurance will pay for it all. That's not how the insurance market works, unfortunately. So that's why I say, if in fact, for the people who believe that was the route to take, excluding the jackasses like the white supremacists and stuff out there, for the folks who are just genuinely that pissed off that they think it's time that we fight, you've got to understand who your problem is. And that's why, again, with the way society is today, that fight's going to be a ugly one. If you try to take on the government and and take your country back by force, that's going to be a very ugly and a very bloody fight. So to me, the way to really go is to stop voting for the two-party dictatorship and start to really get more candidates out there. What say you to that? And then I want to talk to you about some of that third-party stuff.
There's a lot to unpack with all of that. So let me say this. This is a personal experience of mine. I grew up in Concord, North Carolina. We moved there from the DC area in 2006. And I lived in the Concord, Charlotte. When I was a young adult, I bounced back and forth between the two. But I grew up in Concord. I went to Concord Middle and then Concord High School. My mother is a historian by education, and that's something that she's been involved with her whole life, is local history. And she got very involved with local Concord history. She could tell you about all those different buildings. She could tell you about, who used to live on this street and that street. That's her thing. And that was something that I grew up with. And, we spoke earlier about why I got into politics. So it was when I was in the 10th grade that I had a civics and economics teacher. And one day he started talking about the race riots that had happened in Concord, North Carolina in the 1990s. And this was one of my first experiences with understanding the racial divide, was that every single student in the room who was Black or Hispanic or mixed knew what he was talking about. They knew about the riots that had happened in the 90s. Those of us who were white did not. I had never heard about any of this. I had spent tons and tons of time downtown Concord. I knew the mayor, and his wife was actually my 8th grade history teacher. 7th or 8th grade. I forget exactly which one. No, it would be 8th grade. Anyway, but this was the first time I was ever hearing about these riots that had happened. And what had happened was a young man. He was black. He was part of a party outside of either Chick-fil-A or Bojangles in Concord. And the police came to break it up. They pepper sprayed him for unclear reasons. They put him in the back of the cop car. He asphyxiated in the back of the cop car. He died in police custody as a result. That is what led to there were actual riots that did happen in Concord, apparently. And if you look online, there are some news articles that you can still find from archives. Like, I want to say the Miami Sun might have one. The New York Times might have an archived article about what was going on in Concord. Speakers came to speak to them. And it somehow got buried in Concord history. Nobody ever spoke about it. Nobody. And it's almost bizarre, because it was only at this point, I'd been in this town for years, that I had suddenly heard about this. And when I talked to my mother, again, she'd been so involved with, downtown, she'd never heard about it either.
Wow.
Something else that I found out was that as a result of what happened, the city government, which at the time I'm sure was majority, if not entirely white, they imposed zoning restrictions on the majority black neighborhoods in Concord, especially what's called the Logan neighborhood. They put these restrictions on so that they could not build local businesses in their neighborhoods. And you got to think about what they're doing, that they're punishing an entire community that spoke out against one of their own being killed unnecessarily in a way that showed blatant disregard for his life as a human being.
Yeah.
And their way of responding to that was to punish the entire community by making it almost impossible for them to open up their own local businesses. And that was something that was buried from us. And so I appreciate that we're speaking out now, and I appreciate that we have the technology now to record and document what's going on so that we can share it before it can be, in any way silenced. Because when the local cop kills the local kid, it doesn't have to be just a local hush-hush situation anymore, maybe a blurb in the local paper, and that's it. Now it's all over social media. Now we all know about Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. It was, I think, Georgia, where he was run down and killed. We actually saw the video where that happened, and that's the only reason that those people are finally, hopefully, going to see justice. At the very least, they were finally arrested and charged, because they did not charge those people because they saw the video. They charged those people because the public saw the video. And that is one huge reason why people are out there demonstrating right now, is because it shouldn't require those demonstrations, and it should not require the outcry in order for justice itself to be done. Clearly something is broken and needs to be fixed as quickly as possible.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt about it, that if that had been a truck of black men that chased a white guy down and did what happened to Arbery, I believe, like you said, in Georgia, the police would have had no qualms whatsoever about throwing the book at him. Okay, so there is a big difference there, and something that like I brought up in some of the videos that I've done about this is just look how the police would react differently if they went to a house, in an inner city somewhere, and walked in on a room full of people of color and there was a lot of pot in the room. They would arrest them without hesitation, probably throw every drug charge they could at the people. But what happens if they went to, a frat party in the suburbs somewhere and found that same environment, except these people were a little more pale in complexion? I doubt, even they may go to jail, but something tells me they'd probably get a lot more of a slap on the wrist than those other folks would have. And that really speaks to what, a lot of these folks have to go through on a daily basis. But that being said, let's talk about the third parties, and Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So now we know who the two, the big two, assuming that they're both, still around by November. Joe's health certainly isn't the best in the world. And who knows what's going to happen with Donald Trump between now and November. But Joe Biden has officially clinched the Democratic nomination. He has the delegates. So it's going to be Biden and Trump. Uh, Ironically enough, majority of Americans, time after time, always say that they want a third option. They're really not satisfied with a Democrat or Republican. Yet, for some reason, they always go out and vote for one of the two. And in this case, and last time, they voted for what they like to call the lesser of two evils. Now, to me, some people say, well, I'm voting for what's slightly better. I look at that as still voting for an evil. Some folks say, well, we've got to get Biden because we have to get Trump out of office. I say you're screwed either way you go. Certainly, there might be areas where Trump's going to be worse than Biden. Likewise, I could even say there's going to be some where Biden could be worse than Trump. Trump's got a big mouth. There's no doubt about that. He rattles off on Twitter. He certainly instigated a lot of issues. But the one thing that I have to say, excluding what happened with Soleimani and our, pissing contest with Iran, we really haven't gotten into that, to like a new war style conflict. We've kind of continued what was already there. We haven't really branched out into more. We've come close. Venezuela, even early on, we were afraid we were going to wind up in a war with North Korea. But there's one thing that did happen under, Joe Biden / Obama style policies. Obama was the anti-war candidate. We went from 2 conflicts into 7. And so when it comes to something like foreign policy, Trump comes across like a buffoon to the rest of the world. But to me, I feel like Joe Biden could actually, in that department, maybe be a little worse. Likewise, when we hit areas such as trade, for example, Trump has at least brought the attention to trade issues. I don't think he's necessarily handling them in the best of way. For example, this new NAFTA 2.0 really doesn't change much from the original NAFTA. But at least he kind of did get some attention on that, whereas unquestionably, without a doubt, Joe Biden would have been all for TPP, which Trump ran against. He slipped provisions in after being elected. The difference is Joe Biden is not even going to try to bring your attention to these things and talk about how they're a problem. He's all for it in the first place. So when it comes to more domestic issues here at home, such as the jobs and things are concerned, Joe Biden is more of what's cost a lot of these jobs to outsource over the years. Likewise, I would say, Trump ran on it, but he's not a solution to it either. So, to me, I've seen a lot of people, especially because of these riots, that were considering voting third party, and I've really seen it a lot in the YouTube community, a lot of the commentators out there, who were absolutely saying, no, I'm not an any blue will do, and I will not take Joe Biden because he doesn't, represent what I want for my presidential candidate. A lot of them wanted Bernie, some wanted Tulsi. Obviously, we got neither one. And he's really not even close policy-wise to either one. We are talking about a guy here who said that if Medicare for All passed the Senate and the House, he would veto it. Okay? So when you look at that, a lot of them, because they're seeing what's happening in the streets right now, have all of a sudden completely done the 180, and they're now starting to say, well, maybe it's just a little bit better off if we get rid of Donald Trump and hold our nose and jump in this pool and vote for Joe Biden. I'll give you what my thought is and the problem with that, and then tell me what your thought is. Here's my issue, okay? Vote for whoever you want to, but if you weren't going to vote for Joe Biden before now, and you're thinking about voting for Joe Biden because of this now, you're really not going to get progress out of either candidate. Yes, we know if we're seeing how Trump's handling this, so we know probably what the next 4 years would look like. But the only thing you're going to get out of Joe Biden is a superficial, calm voice and a pat on the back. There might be a George Floyd Memorial bridge put up somewhere, probably in one of the worst parts of town, won't be well kept, just like we see with a lot of the Martin Luther King bridges and avenues and whatnot. They're a lot of times not really put in the flashy side of town. It's going to be something along those lines, just to play to a voter, just to play to the base, just to kind of keep you strung along, but there's really going to be no change done to fix the problems here at home. However, here's what I see happening once we take this Joe Biden path. And this is whether these people vote for him or not. If Joe Biden wins in November, you're not going to get the change, first of all. But secondly, Donald Trump has a base that look up to him in a lot of ways, like some people look up to Jesus Christ. Okay? And that's just a fact. They are bought and sold on everything this man has to say. And they are bought and sold that the Democrats have done nothing but hit him with every witch hunt in the book. You hear him talk about it all the times, and the reason he says it's because it gets over with his base. They believe that Russiagate was a witch hunt. Impeachment, another witch hunt. Likewise, they're probably going to come out and say that the reason all this is happening, just like they said about the whole COVID situation, is just a way to try to bury Donald Trump, that blue-collar president. Okay? Here's the thing. Trump goes down in November. His base doesn't go away, in my view. Those people who felt like they were finally shifting the gears and turning America around and taking us back to an age where they were more comfortable and the blue-collar man had a voice again. Those people aren't going away. They're not going away. And I don't think it's going to be Trump that tries to mount another run. Someone else will follow in this man's footsteps, and he will pass a torch to him. And these folks will have a vendetta when that happens. They will feel they have unfinished business, and they will do everything to get him elected. Likewise, I would say after 4 to 8 years of Joe Biden, there's probably not going to be too much enthusiasm for his replacement because policies are probably going to suck. Okay? So when Joe Biden's enthusiasm goes down from his policies, and you've got this group over here that feels they've got this unfinished business, and Trump 2.0 comes along, and judging from where Trump is the most popular, it might be his son, but I would also say you could see someone follow those footsteps, and it would not surprise me in the slightest if they came from the South. Okay? Now, when you add that factor in there, you add this nice, like you hear in my voice, you add this Southern twang with a Trump-style message running for president, oh man, to me it's a recipe for disaster. All this stuff you hear about Trump being racist now, turn it up times 10. And if a guy like that gets elected because of what we're seeing right now, if you think what you see in the streets is bad now, imagine after 8 years of nothing changing from a Joe Biden presidency, and then you get a Trump 2.0 that's worse. Now you're really talking about problems. What do you think about that?
Again, there's a lot to respond to there, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I'm going to try. So I think one thing we need to do right now more than anything is listen to the people who are, there are multiple battles, it feels like, going on in the country at once. There's a battle against racism, there's a battle against police brutality, there's a battle against the coronavirus, there's a battle against rights being infringed upon by the government, whatever, many people have different ideas about what exactly that is. But regardless, you got a lot of battles going on right now.
Yeah.
And I think we need to listen to the people who are on the front lines of those battles, especially. And if we listen to what, for instance, the protesters are saying, they're saying we need change. We need legitimate change because it has not happened. Actually, the last thing that I listened to before we started talking, I was going back and re-listening to a recording that happened just last week in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where that was home for me for a long time. Charlotte's near and dear to my heart. And I was living in Charlotte when the Keith Scott protests happened. I saw the protests that got violent. I also saw days where there were people walking and holding hands and singing together in the streets. And at the same time, you've got Fox News is showing footage of the night before things getting violent, broadcasting it as if this is what's going on live today, and it's not. But you've got this recording from the other night. I'm sorry, I always go off into a tangent. You got this recording from the other night.
I had plenty to say, so don't worry.
And there were these two men, uh, and they were both very emotional about what they were saying to each other. It was a disagreement in the protest. The older man, he was 41, he talked about how every time something happens, they all come together, and he says it's always a kumbaya, it's a kumbaya fucking ya. He does not want to put up with it anymore. He said now's the time for action. He said he's ready to die in order to see change happen, because they change needs to happen. People are dying. It's hard to state that any more bluntly, but people are losing their loved ones, their community members, their friends, their family, their neighbors, and they're worried about losing themselves as well. But so many of these people in there are fighting for the people that they love. And the man who's talking to him was a man in his 30s. He said he had a 5-year-old son. He said that he had been there as well at the Keith Scott demonstrations 4 years prior. He said, we need to find a better way to change this because this is not working. And he pulled a boy over. He said, this boy is only 16 years old. And what he was coming across was, we should not put the 16-year-old in harm's way. He told his kid, putting yourself in harm's way is not the answer. Find a better way than what we're doing.
Right.
But they're saying something's got to change.
Yeah.
And then you look at everything else going on in the country, everything that we've already spoken about, everything from healthcare reform, police reform. There are so many different situations that need to change in this country, and they need to change fast. And it seems like so many, especially your consistent voters, so many of them are so scared of alternate methods, alternate governing styles, alternate ideas, that they have to be given what they consider to be the two safest candidates. And they're not the two safest candidates, but they're the ones that play the most closely to their rhetoric, their desires, and so it is a huge problem with the two-party system. I know that personally I will not be voting for Biden, and I damn sure will not be voting for Trump. I do see myself voting third party as I did 4 years ago. I think that one of the best things that we can do with our vote right now to make it count for the most is to just try to throw any support that you can behind a third party candidate. We need multiple candidates in this country. We need to portray multiple ideas. We need parties that are forced to work together and come up with a compromise in order to reach a majority vote, because that's how it works in almost every developed country out there. That's a parliamentary system. We have a bicameral system that's almost a parliamentary system, but you've got one versus the other, team one versus team two. And that is not the way that the founding fathers originally intended it, but that's the way it has been almost since its inception. It does need to change, but the public needs to change its viewpoint as well. It's not a problem that the government can place solely on society, but it is not a problem that society can place solely on the government either.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right. You need people that can work together. I shared a video and did a little review on it maybe 2 weeks ago at this point. Do you know the actor Michael Douglas?
I'm not familiar.
Okay, I'll send you a link after this and let you see this video, but I found it fairly interesting. And he was talking about the issues with the two parties and whatnot. And he showed it in a graph. It showed basically how much work was done across party lines back in the 50s. Believe it or not, when we got into the 60s, those lines even grew. Okay? But by the time that we got to the 80s, they had really dwindled. By the time we got to the early 2000s, they were a mere pathetic fraction of what they looked like back in the 50s. Even of the 80s, it was absolutely pitiful. Okay? And so that shows you don't have people working together. But here's my thing with the third party, and I'm behind the third party all the way. But again, kind of like I said with the riots, people need to have a realistic game plan that's going to work. To get a third party successful, I feel like you're going to have to really start focusing on a few things. And the first one is ranked choice voting. Are you familiar with what that is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
To me, that is a game changer to get ranked choice voting in this country, because there's a lot of people who just have this conception: if I vote third party, number one, I'm wasting my vote, and number two, I'm actually voting potentially for the one that I deem the worst evil out of the lesser of two evils argument. For example, a lot of people say if you go vote Green Party, you're not helping Biden, you're voting for Trump. Okay? That's what a lot of people's argument is. Likewise, if you're a Trump supporter, or were a Trump supporter, and you think about maybe voting for Joe Jorgensen, for the Libertarian candidate, they're saying, "Oh, you're helping Biden get elected." Okay, so that's kind of the argument a lot of people play to third parties. So ranked choice voting takes that away. You can start with your third party candidate first, and then pick your lesser of two evils after that. Okay, that's the game changer. The other thing is looking at the emphasis. A lot of the folks that I hear talking about looking for a third party candidate, all I ever hear about is president, 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 president. There's more offices than just the president. And here's the problem. I'll play devil's advocate. Say Howie Hawkins or Joe Jorgensen gets elected. They've got to deal with a Republican Senate, Democrat House as things stand right now, right? What do you think that outsider is going to get done with the two parties that don't like him or her in control of the one branch of government where the legislation really gets created and passed before it reaches your desk? You're not going to be able to do everything through an executive action. So the one thing they're probably going to do is work together to gridlock you to death, so it looks like that you were an unsuccessful president that can't get anything done. And then they're going to pool their funds to make sure that no matter which one of them wins, you lose. Okay, so that's the thing with just getting the office of the president. Most structures are built from the ground up. And while I would love to see the third party candidate get elected in November, realistically, I'm more looking at the potential for 2024 because people didn't quite hop on board this time. They thought that maybe the Bernie or the Tulsi could pull through and that would be their candidate for a lot of this cycle. But again, if you're going to take this serious, you should be really advocating for ranked choice voting, but start taking, congressional seats. Start taking senators' seats. Start looking at who you've got up for re-election, and these third parties should really start trying to really make serious efforts at taking chunks out of the House and the Senate. Because once you start to take away that foundation, you're building your foundation. That way, if you get a third party candidate as a president, at least you've got some sort of leverage in the legislative body being, the House and the Senate here, okay? What do you think about that? Is that the game plan that I feel like a lot of these independents are not really looking at when they just focus on the president? And how do you feel about the ranked choice voting?
I think it's not just when it comes to third parties, but in general, people don't place enough importance on the other offices besides the president, because the president is the most obvious and forward-facing office. Right. But another thing is to remember that the reason that one reason that we can assume why the Democrats and Republicans don't like the idea of adding a third party into the mix is because they would be forced to compromise with if there was a third party that held a substantial number of seats in Congress, to the point where no party held the majority, they would have to work together, either with this third party or with each other in order to get anything done. So if you introduce the third party and the two banded together in order to defeat them, they would still be forced to work together, even if it's a short-term thing. Like, we're just going to ally together, defeat our common enemy, and then go back to hating each other. But at the same time, if one of those parties decides that, having this second party over, or this third party over here, means that they don't have to compromise with the Republicans or the Democrats on a matter that they otherwise would have to compromise on, because now they would have the numbers that they needed. So you're looking at a dynamic that would play in on both sides, and so you're always going to get, I think, particular pushback against that from whichever party currently holds the majority, which at this point, obviously in the House, the Democrats hold the majority. In the Senate, it's currently the Republicans, and yeah, nothing is getting done. So really, they're going to have to be held to it by the people who are out here right now who are demanding an end to racist police procedures, racist tactics, the people who are advocating for, before it was a whole coronavirus thing, which I have my personal feelings on that, but we'll save that topic for another time. Regardless, if the people are out here pushing for policy changes, they can be out here pushing for a third party to be admitted into, especially if you go into the media. There should be a third party present in political debates. There should be a third party should be given more consideration for interviews. They should be given just a little more time on broadcast media, especially because that's where they see, that's where they get shut out the most, is with the broadcast media, which is still so popular among a lot of the older voters who make up, you know, most of your regular consistent voters. And that's what I was saying before with the people that both the media and the mainstream politicians are trying to grab right now.
Right, and since you brought this up, talking about getting into the debates, I'm curious if you know, when did the Democrats and the Republicans take control over those, general election debates? Do you know when they did that? When they got scared and because I forget the organization that used to be in control of those debates. I know it was something with a women's organization, but they used to kind of oversee the general election debates, and then that stopped, and the Democrats and the Republicans took it over. Do you know when that was?
I don't know when it was, but what I do know, and this is because actually when I was in college and I was getting communications studies degree with a focus in mass media, actually, and for most of the time I was double majoring in political science as well. I took a class on media law, and one of the things that we spoke about, not in depth as much as other topics, but we still spoke about, was that on broadcast media, and you're talking about TV and radios for the most part, not the internet, but anything that's on like an airwave, because the frequencies are limited, and so the government can kind of pick and choose who gets access to those frequencies to broadcast. They say that those media organizations have to show different points of view. You can't just show one political point of view. You actually have to make time for multiple points. If you give airtime to one candidate, you have to give equivalent airtime to another candidate, or all other candidates, as the case may be. But that only applies to like the major candidates.
Not
if
the
there's somebody who's, you know, running and is considered a long shot, you know, they're going to get maybe 0.5% of the vote.
Exactly.
They don't have to be included. So that's why in these debates, they do have to, you know, they have to give the Democrat point of view. They have to give the Republican point of view. They don't have to give any other partisan point of view. They don't have to give the Libertarian Party. They don't have to give the Green Party. They don't have to really provide a broad left or a broad right kind of view. It's really narrowed down to these two political parties. And that legislation exists on a federal level, as most communication laws do. And it's unlikely to change because obviously it benefits the people who are currently in office. Yeah. And so they're not going to see any real need to change that.
All right, I hope everyone enjoyed the video. I think we touched on a lot of topics there. We were going to touch on just a couple of other things before we wrapped up. Unfortunately, Jess's phone unfortunately died. But I have invited her to come back on the channel, so if you enjoyed the discussion you saw here today, hopefully we can get together and put something else together at some point and drop some more content collaborating with each other. I say collaboration, she's not a YouTuber, but you get the idea. It's always good to collaborate with other people who like to think outside the box and form their own opinions, not just those of the ones that the two-party dictatorship wants you to believe. So again, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, share it around, and we'll hope you'll tune in next time to the Independent Report.